Civil Disobedience and On the Rainy River. These were two readings that we had this week. And I wanted to talk about bringing them together and seeing what the relationship is between these two texts, especially in the context of moral reasoning, which we've been talking about. So the historian Yaroslav Pelikan said that to say yes is also to say no. In other words, when we decide that something, a particular thing, is the right thing to do, we are also deciding that our other options are not the best choice. Or when we decide that we're going to believe one thing, we are rejecting alternatives. So when we say yes to something, we are saying no to other things. So you watched the video, you did the reading on Thoreau, you watched the short video that explains and gives some background to Thoreau. And so the question, a more important question than what does Thoreau believe, is to what is Thoreau saying no? Sometimes students are resistant to the idea of civil disobedience, of breaking the law. They don't like the idea that he's saying it's okay to break the law. However, if we connect this with scripture that we read earlier, where Jesus asked the Pharisees, would you pull a donkey out of a ditch on the Sabbath? It breaks the law to work on the Sabbath because that is considered work. But if you don't pull the donkey out of the ditch, you're going to let the donkey suffer unnecessarily until the next day when you could, under the law, pull the donkey out of the ditch. So there are times when we are called to do justice, and justice and law are not synonyms. They aren't interchangeable because sometimes laws are unjust. Slavery and segregation laws, those were legal, but they weren't moral. So let's excuse the idea that you should never break the law, because sometimes we're called to break the law if the laws are unjust. To return to Micah 6:8, we're called to act justly. And we have to look to God for the definition of justice, not to the government. So if we excuse that idea that Thoreau is he's saying to break the law, if we accept that there are times when we break the law, we need to think about, to what is Thoreau saying no? He's saying, yes, break the law if the laws are unjust. What he's saying no to is injustice. He's saying no to slavery. He's saying no to the Mexican War, which was an oppressive war. He's saying no to, essentially, to allowing government to define his conscience for him. Allowing what the government says is legal to become the basis for what he decides is moral. He is going to use his own intellect, his own moral compass to determine for him his faith, his understanding of the concept of justice, to decide for him what is right. So he's rejecting this idea that people should just listen to the government and blindly follow like automatons, like robots, whatever the government dictates. So what do we do with this in the context of On the Rainy River, the short story by Tim O'Brien? O'Brien is really dealing with this question of morality. He's writing this story from the perspective of a young man who gets drafted to go to Vietnam. He's been accepted to Harvard. That's his plan. You know, when we're young, we make plans. And when something disrupts those plans, it can create create a whole lot of anxiety in us. So we have this young man who has worked hard to get into Harvard, got accepted to Harvard, ready to go, and then he gets drafted. And it creates this crisis of conscience in him because he's got to decide if he's going to go to Vietnam or if he's going to run away to Canada. So he tells us, all of us, I suppose, like to believe that that in a moral emergency, he tells us that we all want to believe that in a moral emergency, we will behave like the heroes of our youth. But bravery is so much harder. Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, makes it seem very easy and neat. He decides he's not going to pay the tax that is due to support the Mexican War, and he goes to jail. And it's easy. But O'Brien helps us to see the complexity of moral choices. We all think we're going to be brave. We all think it's going to be easy. Well, I can always do the right thing. But it's not easy. A lot of anxiety comes with making moral choices, and O'Brien highlights that for us. And he tells us that a lot of the resistance, I think we can all relate to this, a lot of the resistance to doing the right thing is fear. It's scary. It's scary because it may come with consequences. If we believe that doing the right thing comes without consequences, we haven't read Scripture. Look at Jesus. He did absolutely the right thing. And there's no question about that. And boy, he suffered grave consequences. So we want to believe that we can do the right thing and the world will appreciate that and never challenge us. So sometimes we don't do it because we're afraid of consequences. Sometimes we don't do it because we're afraid of judgment. What if the people around us think we're wrong? Or what if they think we're cowards? We don't want to be judged by our parents. What if they think we're bad people because we end up in jail because we did the right thing? So a lot of times it's that fear and anxiety that leads us to do something against our conscience. And he goes on to say, when he has to make the choice, when he's on the Rainy River that separates the United States from Canada, and he has to decide if he's going to run away and go to Canada or if he's going to go to Vietnam, he says it comes down to a sense of shame. He didn't want to be ashamed. He didn't want people to call him a coward because he didn't go to the war. He doesn't want to embarrass his parents. And then doing what he deems to be the wrong thing because he's afraid causes even more shame. He tells us, essentially, he writes that he confronted a future that he didn't understand and didn't want. He'd had a plan, and he'd worked toward that plan, but in an instant, it changed. It was Vietnam or Canada, but not Harvard. So in that moment on the river, he imagines that he sees on one bank all of the outcome of either life. On one bank, he sees the townspeople and the president and his baseball coach and his family, all the people that he would disappoint if he didn't go to the war, all the people that have taught him the importance of duty. And on the other bank, he sees all of the tragedy that would be the outcome of going to war, the victims of war, the man he would kill, the friends he would lose, the wife and child that he may not have if he doesn't survive this war. And he weighs those two things. If he went to the war, if I go to the war, I would kill and maybe die. But he did it because he was embarrassed not to. He concludes the essay by saying, I was a coward. I went to the war. We often don't think about going to war as a cowardice act. What he's saying there is because he didn't act in accordance with his conscience. He didn't take a difficult moral stand. Then he feels like he was a coward. Now, I want to clarify, he does differentiate between what he considers to be righteous and moral wars, such as World War II. He is talking not about war, he is talking about a particular war. And even today, in retrospect, there is a great deal of question about whether Vietnam was a justifiable war. And so he's not saying that men should never go to war. He's saying this war, for him, didn't seem morally clear. Okay, so to what is O'Brien saying no? I want you to think about that question. To what is he saying? He says, yes, I will go to the war. When he says, yes, I'll go to the war, to what is he saying no? What is he saying he will not do? And what does that mean?